I'm Eric Parker. This morning on CT22, putting the brakes on doing business in Russia. A list of companies who've decided to do just that is getting a lot of attention. We'll run down a who's who and why a Connecticut professor started the list. Meat, dairy, basic pantry staples, all getting more expensive by the day. We'll talk to an industry expert for insight on when prices might top out and even trend down. Plus, we'll have his suggestions on the best ways you can save. And you may remember this video. It shined a light on inadequate facilities at the women's NCAA tournament. It went viral a year ago. We'll find out what's changed this time around. It's all ahead this Sunday, March the 27th. CT22 starts right now.
From WFSB, this is CT22 with Eric Parker, sponsored by Hartford Healthcare.
Good morning. As the war in Ukraine hits the 1-month mark, we're seeing more and more companies backing out of doing business in Russia. It started with dozens, then ballooned to hundreds, and a Yale Business School professor is keeping tabs on all of them. Joining me now is Jeffrey Sonnenfeld. Professor, well, you've made this list. It's getting a lot of attention. It started very early on in this conflict and has grown by leaps and bounds. Why do you think so many people are following it?
Oh, thanks, Eric. In the beginning, you said it exactly right. There were a few dozen, and we just wanted to celebrate and understand who they were. Unexpectedly, it was some major oil companies and professional service firms that would usually jump off a cliff rather than get involved in conflict. And then, of all things, big tech, that's often been in the shadows of controversy lately. Those were the first movers here, which was surprising. But we didn't do anything at that point until we saw a lot of these Klingons, people who were using artful public relations as smokescreens to act like they were doing something more than they were. We thought, well, what we can do as a schoolhouse, as a university, bring some objective, authoritative evaluation of who's really doing what. So it was to blow away the smokescreen. What happened, though, we didn't expect. It saluted the good guys who were really courageous, gave confidence to the wannabe good guys, and then wound up shaming a lot of the people who were on a list they didn't want to be on.
A lot to unpack in that opening answer, but I want to start with your your count, because I know it's changing by the moment. So any count that we give would probably be dated the moment you say it. But you said it started with dozens. About where are we at today?
Well, even while we're on the show, yes, it's changing. I just see the numbers are still changing right through the weekend, but it's pushing 500. So I think by the time we hit Monday, we should have crossed 500, and it is remarkable. We've never seen anything like this in American history. We did a big business boycott in the late 1980s in support of the South African governmental economic sanctions. 200 companies pulled out of South Africa then, but we're far ahead of that now.
How big of a deal for people who don't have maybe the view of the business world that you do? If you're a global company, a company we've all heard of, you talked about some of the oil companies who were early on in this. How big of a deal is it for a global company to say, we're done with Russia? Is it a big hit?
It is, surprisingly so, given that, say, BP, it was $15 billion that they left on the table, and that there was Shell left somewhere around $5 or $6 billion, and a little bit more than that with Exxon, $7 billion. So it wasn't just political correctness or something they walked away. It had very meaningful consequences financially for them, but they felt it was the right thing to do. It was quite impressive. And that, of course, inspired many other firms to follow.
We've seen from time to time big companies take a social stance, and maybe in recent years even more than from time to time, whether it be Black Lives Matter or Me Too movements, companies stepping up and saying we're going to use our position in the world to do some good, or what we view as some good. Is that important as you look at in the School of Management, as you talk to these students who are going to be coming up through the ranks and sitting on corporate boards, that be recognized?
I'm so glad you flagged that and make it into the larger issue that we don't really have a chance usually to talk about. And that is the role of business leadership in society. Every survey tells us today, whether or not it's the Harris poll or the Gallup polls or Morning Consult's overnight surveys or the Edelman Trust Barometer, tells us that business leaders are ascendant, surprisingly so, given corporate governance scandals of a decade ago, as the most trusted voices in American society. I think it would be edged out by the military if they were allowed to speak on these political matters, but they can't. But it towers over, of course, national political figures, but even state and local have taken a step back. And journalists, I'm sorry to say, and academics for both of us is that we don't have quite the same clear influence we once did. And I shouldn't say this on a Sunday morning, but even the clergy's taking a hit, and business leaders have been soaring. So they've stepped up to the plate on a whole host of issues, whether or not it's immigration reform or gun safety or voting rights or issues having to do with gender equity or racial justice. So it has been climate change, very, very impressive. And it's not that they're woke, although they are proud to be awake and not asleep, is that this is definitely in the center lane of business activity.
You mentioned as the list grew, you referred to the sort of the second group to jump on your list as the Klingons. And I saw a quote from you that as some companies jump in, it's sort of a strength in numbers thing, that other people can look at those courageous first actors and say, yeah, we'll do that too. Is that what you find?
It is what I find. And since we're just among Connecticut friends here, I can whisper to you the secret that I haven't really wanted to talk about publicly is that the consumer goods firms, the apparel makers and fashion companies, fast food companies, they were kind of late to join the event, to join the movement here. And they usually are on the front lines. And if you look at the trying to avoid the Uyghur fine cotton that comes out, in Xinjiang province, which is a product of forced labor, that the apparel makers were right out in front on that. And these companies are usually sensitive to public sentiment, but also backlashes and boycotts. In this case, they were very reluctant. They wanted to look around and see what everybody else is doing. In the corporate world, they call it benchmarking, of course, but to get that peer affirmation that they're not out on a limb by themselves. And when they saw everybody else was doing it, then we see Coke and McDonald's and Pepsi and Starbucks and others, and even Starbucks, even Subway's has moved along here down the road. They're a little bit late, but we're glad to see them start to move to the right side of the issues here.
Well, and that group shift that you talk about, I mean, it's evident in things like I saw a statement from Apple saying we didn't shut down the App Store, but that's because we think it might be a way to get, people on the ground in Russia information that they need. So companies who made a conscious choice not to necessarily decide to leave completely felt they needed to explain why. So that speaks to how big a deal this is, right?
It's a really big deal. Is when you add all this up, putting aside the governmental economic sanctions of these 50 countries from around the world, led by the U.S. and Europe, but the rest of the world too, is that apart from that, just these businesses are almost 25% of the GDP, 25% of the economy of Russia. It's around like 23% as we've added up their impact. So it is a big deal. It's enormous. And the goal of this is not to just make Russians suffer, innocent civilians that have nothing to do with it. It is to wake them up. There's a certain complacency they have, and it gets messages past the idea that President Putin is this all-powerful totalitarian. If it shows that breaks down civil society, this is what Gandhi did, of course, in India. This is how we saw government change in Romania with Nicolae Ceausescu, or Erich Honecker in East Germany, or in Poland or elsewhere. If you want to have a bloodless change of government, you've got to show that this tyrant is not in control like they say they are, and halting civil society like this is the best way to do it.
Well, it certainly is a fascinating topic, and as you created that list, you saw the attention grow. We appreciate you being with us. Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, your title, I didn't give it at the beginning, Senior Associate Dean for Leadership Studies at the Yale School of Management. Thank you for being with us here on CT22. Hopefully we'll have you again.
Most honored. Thank you.